thanks, Richard, for that kind introduction, and thanks to OMG for holding this event and for letting me come and speak with you this morning. I think what I can do for you today is give you a little bit of my view of where we see the current cybersecurity threat and how that threat is evolving, and then some of what we're actually trying to do to counter that threat. And how that actually, I think, connects in with some of the work that you're doing here. From our point of view, we actually very much see ourselves as being at a strategic inflection point. For 40 years, arguably, the internet and cyberspace has been a strategic asset, a very significant strategic asset for the United States. But we're at a point where if we do not begin to actually solve some of the vexing cybersecurity challenges that we face, we risk cyberspace and the internet becoming instead a strategic liability for us. And so that's why we feel so very strongly, and why the President feels so strongly, that we have to make cybersecurity a priority, and why this administration has prioritized working on the cybersecurity problem. Now, there are 3 or 4 trends in this area that I think make this a particularly troubling threat. One of which, of course, I know that I saw some signs for the industrial internet. So one of those trends is intimately connected with that. The fact that we continue to make cyberspace bigger. We keep hooking more and more stuff up to the internet so that our coffee maker, our car, our Fitbit is all going to be a threat vector. So the threat is becoming broader and more diverse. And some of us in this room that have been working on this for a while, we thought doing cybersecurity in a world of wired desktops was hard. So now we're going to do it in the big data mobile cloud out in this industrial internet. So we've just made the problem that much harder to tackle. The threat is also becoming more sophisticated. If you look at, and I don't just mean technically, yes, we are certainly beyond the days of most people falling for the email with the Nigerian prince who would like your money. Yeah, I know that that's all still filling your spam folders, but what I actually mean is that the bad guys are becoming more organizationally sophisticated. The level of organization that they are bringing to this, the specialization that they are bringing to their hacking endeavors, they are essentially running businesses. So they're bringing the capability of industry and business to the hacking business. It's not really the lone hacker in his pajamas in his mother's basement that we're really worried about anymore. It's industrial. Somebody actually used the term the industrialization of hacking, which I actually think is a very apt description of what is happening. Of course, the attacks and intrusions and other things are becoming more frequent. Some of us actually refer to 2014 as the year of the breaches, of all the major retailers essentially getting hit in this space. And lastly, the threat is becoming more dangerous. As we witnessed with the attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment, the willingness of those that are carrying out intrusions and attacks to actually cause destructive effects is growing. So when you combine all of those trends, a broader, more diverse threat, one that's more sophisticated, one that's more frequent, and one that's more dangerous, you get a particularly toxic mix of threats that we think poses a very, very significant problem for us in the long run. And we're seeing this manifest in multiple different ways. The theft of PII, as I mentioned, and the risk that everybody's personal information has, the potential for disruption of our critical infrastructure, things that we sort of almost, particularly in the United States, assume just sort of goes on in the background, our power, our water, telecommunications, all those things that we mostly just assume sort of work. We also are concerned about cyber-enabled economic espionage. The theft of intellectual property and our trade secrets is very troublesome. And then, of course, the emergence of cyber as a tool of statecraft is probably one of the single most important trends that we see. Various countries, not just up at the high end, but all up and down around the world, are beginning to integrate cyber capabilities into their standard tool set of their economic, law enforcement, diplomatic, and military capabilities, which means that we must be prepared for that in kind. So, clearly we have, I've been working on this problem for a while, and many of you in this room have been working on it for considerably longer. And one of the things that actually strikes us as you actually take a look at this problem is that at one level, when you step back, cybersecurity really ought to be easy. After all, the vast majority of intrusions rely on known fixable vulnerabilities. The bad guys are getting in through vulnerabilities that we know about, we know how to fix, and could have fixed. So what's going on? Clearly this means the problem isn't actually that simple. And so let me offer a few thoughts on sort of why that is and why we find ourselves in this situation. One of which is, I think, that we clearly just don't understand the economics of cyberspace. And it's what I just said. The challenges we face are not new. I mean, the password has been around and we've known that it's crappy for like 30 years as a means of cybersecurity, but yet it's still here. Yes, the adversary's tactics evolve, and the impact of malicious behavior is growing, but many of the same fundamental weaknesses remain. And it's not like we don't even collectively understand these facts at this point. Certainly, numerous news reports on cyber breaches and identity theft have helped raise awareness. And it's not like anybody's wandering around saying, I'd really like to be bad at my cybersecurity as a goal. So the logical conclusion has to be that we don't fully understand the economics and psychology of cybersecurity. Security is viewed as too hard because it makes things inconvenient, or it's viewed as too expensive because of the resources that may be required. So in this environment, I think we need to actually really begin to take a leaf from the way that we've started to look at behavioral economics and human psychology and bring many more of those tools into the cybersecurity space. We need to move cybersecurity out of the server room and into the boardroom and into many of the other conversations that are going on, and integrate tools from across multiple disciplines to actually deal with this. So, for example, we've actually learned in dealing with retirement systems that if you make your retirement system opt-in, you get some crazy take rate, like 95%. If you make your system opt-out, you get this crazy take rate, right? If it's opt-in, you only get like 50% of the people will actually check the box and go in. But if you make it opt-out, where you're automatically enrolled unless you take the effort to disenroll yourself, most people are inherently lazy, and they will just go with the flow. And we need to make cybersecurity the same way, so that basically we essentially make cybersecurity an opt-out process where people are inherently secure unless they take the effort to be insecure. So unless we really come to understand the human and economic factors and integrate that into our cybersecurity approaches, we're going to continue to flail at solving this problem. Now, the second hard problem, I think, actually stems from the ironic success of the internet and cyberspace itself. The vast extent and impact of cyberspace that we've already been talking about contributes to this problem. When we first built the internet, critical infrastructure wasn't connected to it. Nobody cared about privacy protocols because people didn't post their cat videos online. And security was largely still based in the physical world. Governments didn't understand the internet, didn't use it much, and they sure didn't see why they should care about it at that point. So we basically didn't care that the technologists set up the internet to be governed in a highly decentralized way outside of government-based structures. But part of the challenge is that now everybody cares about these things, at least to some degree. And what that's done is it's meant that it's become much harder for us to take collective action to fix the problems. Governments are waking up to the fact that they really need to care about the internet and how it works, for all sorts of reasons, both good and bad. And so, as a result, what we used to be able to relegate into the technological space or be done by informal agreements, for example, among internet service providers, is now the focus of a really highly political process. And that means decisions, including decisions about information sharing standards and information security protocols that were once easy have now become hard. And this situation is not likely to change. It is only going to actually get more complicated over time. So we need to also come to understand and be able to deal with that space. I would also say that another problem stems from the very structure of cyberspace itself. And it's the fact that you often hear the argument that cyberspace has no borders. And I would argue that that's actually not quite correct. There are borders and boundaries everywhere in cyberspace. There are firewalls, there are routers, there are where network connections happen, where internet service providers touch each other. The problem with cyberspace is that it has no interior. There is no inside to a network when you really think about it. That everyone lives and operates as an organization, as individuals. You live at the boundary. You live at the border. And what this means is that the traditional ways that we have organized ourselves to do security in the physical world don't map onto cyberspace very well. So we have assigned the role of border security, for example, in the physical world to the federal government. But if everybody in the United States lives right on the Rio Grande, then whose job is it to do border security? You can't physically assign that to one segment or part of the population or any of the institutions in society. It means that cybersecurity becomes an inherently shared mission between the government and the private sector and individuals at literally the level of physics and math in a way that is completely inseparable. And as a result, our traditional models for how we chop up who does what in security spaces, like in counterterrorism or in police work and law enforcement, don't work in cyberspace. So what we have to do is we actually have to change our approach and mindset in order to actually tackle these three problems that I've laid out. And so really the administration's focus in this area has been putting in place the building blocks to raise our cyber defenses across our critical infrastructure to address those problems, to disrupt some of the cyber threats before they occur, and then to respond and recover from those threats once they've happened. And so we're working across multiple lines of effort. But what I'll do today is I'll highlight a few of those that I think are particularly relevant to this group and what you're doing in terms of how we are trying to build the tools for public-private partnership. As I've said, since it is an inherently shared mission, we've got to build some new processes, new tools, new ways of doing business between the government and the private sector that's not a traditional regulatory approach that the government often takes. It's not even a contractual approach that the government often takes where we're buying goods and services from the private sector. It's some form of new partnership. We don't even have a name for it. Any of y'all want to come up with one that actually sticks? We will certainly run with that because I think it's a completely new way of actually thinking about this level of interaction. So there are some places where we've actually made some tremendous progress. For example, over 2 years ago now, the President issued Executive Order 13636, which was on critical infrastructure cybersecurity. And in that, we took a very different approach to managing this relationship. We called upon the private sector, under the auspices of NIST, to develop a cybersecurity framework of standards and best practices. And inherently, this framework that was really led and driven by industry ultimately takes a risk management approach. And the real strength of the framework that emerged from that is that it is deeply embedded in how industry and the private sector has to think about the cybersecurity problem as one of managing risk. And it puts it into a language that CEOs and boards can understand. And it provides a common lexicon for communication between the government and the private sector to enable much more rich conversations to go on. And so now we have this shared vocabulary that allow us to have these kinds of conversations and make some progress. So one of the other things this executive order did was it started down a path related to information sharing, which is one of the key building blocks. If you're going to have an effective partnership between the government and the private sector, you need to be moving lots of information back and forth. So that particular executive order dealt with the government to private sector side of the equation. And what it did was it basically flipped the default in the government. It said if the government has information that is related to the targeting of a particular company or organization in the private sector, we are going to share that information. We're going to figure out a way to get the classified information downgraded to get it to that company. We're going to figure out a way to increase the volume, the timeliness, and the utility of the information that we push out. And so we've been working on that for the last couple of years to actually increase that flow of information from the government to the private sector. But of course, that's not all that we actually needed to do. We also wanted to increase the level of information sharing that comes back from the private sector. And we want to encourage the sharing of information, perhaps most importantly, among companies in the private sector. Now, for some of that, we're likely to require legislation, and when I'm done, if you want to ask me questions about what's going on in Congress, you can do that. And so a piece of that will have to be ultimately getting to some legislation. But that's a long and involved process, which means that we're not going to get there for a while. So while we continue to work closely with Congress on legislation, we wanted to take some other steps to encourage the development of the information sharing that I was just discussing. And so that's the most recent executive order, 13691, and it's promoting private sector information sharing. And it's really just focused on a couple of key things. And it directs the Department of Homeland Security to select through an open and competitive process a non-governmental organization or organizations to serve as essentially the information sharing and analysis organization, standards organization. And the reason that we picked the term information sharing and analysis organization is that we wanted to encompass as broad models for that information sharing as we could possibly manage. So the existing information sharing and analysis centers like the Financial Services ISAC or the Energy ISAC, those are certainly flavors of ISALs, very important ones. And I would think would, in the language of retail, would be our anchor tenants in many ways. But they're not the only model that's out there. And we wanted to be able to encompass multiple models for what we want these information sharing organizations to do. So we want to create a model and establish a process so that you can actually understand, if you're a business, what those ISALs are going to do and how do you know which ones are good. From the government side, we want, and which ones of those, by the way, that will actually help you with a value proposition that says they will be valuable to your organization. From the government side, we want to know that the organizations that we're pushing this information out to, what they're going to do with it, how they're going to protect it, what controls do they have in place, how are they connected to their members, so that we have transparency and understanding in that space. So the executive order also requires that the Department of Homeland Security engage in continuous, collaborative, and inclusive coordination with ISALs via the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, or the NCIC, which coordinates the cybersecurity information and sharing and analysis among the federal government. And also, there was a part of the executive order that was written in highly technical EOEs, but what it actually did was it fixes a long-standing problem in how we grant clearances to private sector individuals. The old model was really highly dependent in the defense industrial sector, where a company was going to get a clearance because it wanted to actually sell stuff to the government. And as a result, had some expectation of actually recouping the costs of getting a security clearance. In the case of many people in the critical infrastructure, that's not true. So we needed to create an easier and lighter weight means for those individuals to get a security clearance. And that's what that particular section of the EO does. So we are in the process of implementing the executive order. The President signed this executive order back in February at the White House Cybersecurity Summit summit on cybersecurity and consumer protection out at Palo Alto at Stanford, where the weather was very nice and much nicer than back here in DC. Some of us were wondering why we came back from that. But I think really we're in the process of doing the executive order in as open and as public a way as we can manage. That we want it to be an inclusive process. We want it to result in some action, though, something that organizations can actually take and do something with. And we want it to be transparent, something that everybody can look at and understand and reason through why we got there. And obviously one that can be trusted, such that that those that participate in an information sharing organization can trust that their information will be both protected and used properly and in the ways that they understand, and that the government understands how its information will be used. We have a whole lot of other efforts that are ongoing across the cybersecurity space, efforts that we are focused on raising the government's own cybersecurity practices, increasing the tools that are available to the federal government to disrupt malicious cyber actors when they're trying to carry out their activities, building the capabilities across that full spectrum that you need to not only detect and protect your information, but also respond and recover from cyber incidents once they happen. It's a very interesting and exciting time to be involved in this area, and the administration has a lot of activity going on. But let me close by saying that cybersecurity is an inherently hard problem for at least the reasons that I cited and probably more. But I do believe that we are actually starting to see our way through to some of the models that will enable us to change the cyber landscape in some very foundational ways. The cybersecurity framework and our new information sharing executive order provide a way to raise the level of cybersecurity in our critical infrastructure. It gives us a lexicon and a construct to have some of the conversations and to build the partnerships that I was referring to. And the work that you're doing here with the standards for the information sharing area are a key part of that effort. And I look forward to your continuing engagement in this area. But thank you very much. If you want, I have time for a couple of questions.
Yes, so actually there's time for some questions, and there's a microphone here if anybody wants to ask a question. And while you think about the question, step up to the microphone. I don't see anybody doing that yet. That means I get to ask the question. So there are two things you said that I thought really need a little bit more discussion. One is that an organization or organizations will be chosen, and you did mention that this group of organizations, the Standards Coordinating Council, is developing relevant standards. But you also said EOEs, which means that it's not necessarily true that everybody understands how that choosing is going to happen. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit. And again, there's a microphone there if you'd like to ask some questions.
Sure. So I think in all honesty, we are still building the answer to that question. We've never quite done anything exactly like this. We have some models from what NIST has done in some previous efforts. We've never quite followed this path. So we are actually figuring, there's a degree to which, in all honesty, we're figuring this out as we go. Because, again, we're trying to build these new capabilities. I think ultimately what we are looking for in some of the initial requests for information and comment that DHS has issued, we're actually even looking for input into how we should run our own selection process, and what factors and criteria should we use in actually even making those selections, and how should that work, and all of that needs to be finalized and will be part of the EO implementation process.
So fair enough, and I know there are several organizations here that are planning on responding to that request. Any questions?
Yes, sir. Good morning, sir. You made the comment about the lack of understanding of the economics of the cybersecurity dilemma. There's also a fundamental lack of metrics in terms of measuring the problem, especially within the CGIS data set. Is there any thought process at the administration level about changing that deficiency, creating recurring metrics that really define the scope of the problem.
Sure. So, as Richard mentioned, I actually worked for a very long time at the Office of Management and Budget, and we love metrics as budget and finance guys. It is one of my continuing frustrations that our metrics in cyberspace are not where in cybersecurity are not where they need to be. So we are very much interested in how do you actually get beyond simply measuring compliance and actually start measuring cybersecurity outcomes. There is some truth to the fact that there is a lot of truth to the fact that we're so bad at some of the basics that for many organizations, just getting them to actually do things like, did you actually change the default password on that server? That's still where we need to be. But clearly, for some of the more sophisticated organizations, both in the public and the private sector, we're starting to think about what are the useful long-term metrics that we would want to focus on, and what because what you measure often drives what you do, and so making sure that we choose those correctly so that they actually affect the long-run problem is very important.
I think this is an issue since it came up with breakfast as well. Another question here? Yeah, about 5 more minutes.
Yep.
One of the things you mentioned was the government sharing information with the private sector. I know in DoD, and they've talked about this for several months, if not for a couple of years, of opening up information where they can share it. And you mentioned declassifying information, but again, they've talked about that for at least several months or a year. Is there actually any progress to being able to do that? Because I know when I worked in DoD, immediately that's classified, and that's not going anywhere. So is there any actual progress to being able to move that information out where they can share that information to make the private companies aware of what the breaches actually are?
Yeah, so we actually have made progress in that area, and it's a tough one. But for example, we are holding ourselves accountable to moving that information out faster. In many cases, the products that we are designing that are coming out, the products that are being produced that are coming out of places like NSA and CIA already come with Terra lines built in. They're getting produced in that way, so that we're able to actually move that quickly. In some cases, we've managed to cut our cycle time from weeks down to hours in terms of what we're able to push out. I think the conversation that we're really having too is also, where is the government's value add in this process? In many cases, the private sector actually, depending on who you're talking to, actually may see more than the government and have more information in terms of IP addresses and things like that than the government does. But the government sees different things. And because of the nature of our law enforcement authorities and our intelligence authorities, we see the world differently. And what that means is that we need to think about not just what and the volume of information that we're pushing out, but make sure that it's actually something that is valuable and adds to what the private sector can produce. And in many cases, this is figuring out a way for us to talk about the context, to talk about the tactics, techniques, and procedures, to talk about how what you may be seeing as a private company fits into the larger cybersecurity picture. And how to do that in a way that still protects sources and methods is a very challenging debate, and one that will continue, I think, for several years. But it is one that we are definitely making progress on. I will say that we're also very mindful, though, of as we push more of this information out, we also want to make sure that there's somebody on the other end who can do something with it. Because in many cases, yes, your large financial sector firms that have, 1,000-person security organizations can consume a fair amount of cyber intelligence. But many organizations that are even still quite substantial but are not in that league have trouble consuming information that we push out. So we also need to be mindful that we are actually producing information and produce it in a form that people can actually use.
We have time for just one more.
Good morning, Kurt Clune from Justice. Say, could could you go ahead and talk about the legislation that's started?
Sure. So I think that you've actually seen several bills come out recently, including several an information sharing bill from the Senate Intelligence Committee. The House Intelligence Committee has one. House Homeland has one. Senate Homeland has one. We've got data breach bills coming out from some of the Commerce committees, all of which is very good. I think where we are in the process is we've actually made a lot of progress from some of the previous versions in the previous Congress. We are very actively engaged with the Hill. In fact, I have been teasing the legislative affairs folks in my office that they seem to be intent on making sure that I am living up on Capitol Hill for large-sized chunks of the week. But conveniently, Congress seems to only work Tuesday to Thursday, so that seems to help. But I think we are making a lot of progress, and I think we are seeing a lot of positive indications there. There's still a long road to go with several complex issues related to liability protection being a very, very key one for us to work through. But I'm actually cautiously optimistic in this space that we can get legislation that can pass both the House and Senate and the President can sign across the finish line. But thank you very much for letting me come and chat with you today, and I hope you have a very productive day. Thank you very much.